She traded her velvet gowns for a life of dirt, walking away from a wealthy lord to marry a nameless stable hand. The entire kingdom laughed at her disgrace. But their laughter died in their throats the night her humble husband's eyes flashed gold, and the wolves began to bow. The grand halls of Silverpine Estate were suffocating. To the outside world, the territory of Oakhaven was a beacon of wealth and medieval prosperity, a place where noble bloodlines dictated one's worth, and the strength of a werewolf pack determined one's survival. But to Genevieve Sterling, daughter of Lord Reginald Sterling, it was a gilded cage built on crippling debt and hollow pleasantries. Her father's coffers had run dry years ago, drained by poor investments and a desperate need to maintain the illusion of opulence. The solution to his financial ruin was simple, brutal, and entirely expected. Genevieve was to be sold into a marriage she abhorred. Lord Frederick Montgomery was the wealthiest beta in the Southern Territories. He was a man of sharp, cruel features and an even sharper temper. He wore his wealth like a weapon, draped in furs and heavy gold chains, his eyes constantly roving over the people of Oakhaven, as if calculating their monetary value. When he looked at Genevieve, he didn't see a woman with a sharp mind or a fierce spirit. He saw a prized mare, a beautiful trophy to complete his sprawling estate. It is a match ordained by the goddess herself, Lord Reginald had declared one freezing November evening, his voice trembling slightly as he handed Genevieve the engagement contract. Frederick will clear our debts. You will be the lady of the Montgomery lands. You should be weeping with gratitude, Genevieve. Genevieve had not wept. She had stared at the parchment, her heart turning to lead. She knew what happened to the women Frederick grew bored of. They became shadows, confined to the darkest wings of his manor, silenced and broken. Desperate for air, Genevieve began slipping away from the main castle in the early hours of dawn, seeking refuge in the sprawling, muddy grounds of the lower estate. It was there, amidst the scent of wet hay and rusted iron, that she first saw Arthur. He was a nobody, a drifter who had arrived at Silverpine a month prior, offering his labor in exchange for a cot in the stables and a hot meal. He spoke to no one, kept his head down, and worked with a quiet, terrifying efficiency. He was impossibly tall, his shoulders broad beneath a threadbare linen shirt that did nothing to hide the heavy, corded muscles of his arms. His hair was a dark, messy tangle, and a thick beard obscured the lower half of his face. But it was his eyes that caught Genevieve off guard, a piercing, storm-glass gray that seemed to see straight through the silk of her dress and into the marrow of her bones. Their first encounter was an accident. Genevieve's prized stallion, terrified by a sudden thunderstorm, had broken loose in the courtyard. While the castle guards shouted uselessly, Arthur simply stepped into the mud, raised a single, calloused hand, and issued a low, guttural click from his throat. The panicked beast froze, its ears pinning back not in fear, but in absolute, unquestioning submission. Genevieve had watched, breathless, as Arthur gently took the reins. When he handed them back to her, their fingers brushed. A shock of heat, electric and terrifying, shot up Genevieve's arm. The air around them suddenly smelled of crushed pine needles, petrichor, and raw, untamed power. Arthur had stiffened, his gray eyes widening for a fraction of a second before his expression shuddered into a mask of polite indifference. "Your horse, my lady," he had murmured, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. "Thank you, Arthur, isn't it?" she had replied, her voice uncharacteristically breathless. That brief touch changed everything. In the werewolf world, the mate bond was a myth spoken of in hushed, reverent tones, a soul-deep connection that defied rank, wealth, and logic. Genevieve had never believed in it, yet she found herself drawn to the muddy stables day after day. She brought him extra bread from the kitchens. He carved her a small, intricate wooden wolf from a piece of scrap oak. They spoke in hushed tones, while he polished saddles, discussing the philosophy of the old packs, the stars, and the suffocating nature of their respective lives. He never treated her like a porcelain doll, and she never treated him like a servant. Then came the night of the autumn equinox gala, the night Frederick Montgomery intended to formally announce their betrothal. The great hall was a sea of velvet and diamonds. The wealthiest alphas and betas of Oakhaven mingled, their laughter echoing off the vaulted stone ceilings. Genevieve stood beside her father, her stomach churning as Frederick approached, a smug, possessive smirk on his lips. He raised his crystal goblet, demanding the room's attention. "My lords and ladies," Frederick bellowed, his voice carrying over the music. "Tonight, I claim my greatest prize. The beautiful Genevieve Sterling has agreed to become my mate and my wife." The crowd erupted into polite applause. Frederick reached for her hand. Genevieve looked at him. She looked at his soft, manicured hands, felt the cold emptiness in her chest, and then she looked toward the back of the hall. Standing in the shadows by the servants' entrance, smelling faintly of wood smoke and rain, was Arthur. He wasn't supposed to be there. His jaw was clenched, his gray eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made the room spin. In that moment, the choice was terrifyingly simple. Genevieve snatched her hand away from Frederick. The movement was sharp enough to make a few nearby nobles gasp. "I have agreed to no such thing, Lord Frederick," Genevieve said, her voice ringing out, clear as a bell, across the sudden, dead silence of the hall. Frederick's smile vanished. "Genevieve, stop this foolishness. The contract is signed." "By my father, not by me," she replied, her chin raised. "I will not marry you. I would rather live with nothing than be bound to a man with no honor and no soul." "Genevieve!" Lord Reginald roared, his face purple with rage. "You are disgracing us. Who else would have you? You belong to Frederick." "I belong to no one," Genevieve countered, her heart hammering against her ribs. She stepped down from the dais, the heavy silk of her gown rustling in the breathless silence of the room. She walked past the gaping lords and sneering ladies, past the shocked whispers of her peers, straight to the shadows by the door. She stopped in front of the towering, dirt-smudged stable hand. "Will you take me away from here?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, but her eyes resolute. Arthur looked down at her. For a moment, the entire kingdom seemed to hold its breath. Then, a soft, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his mouth. He reached out with a rough, calloused hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. The spark of the mate bond flared to life, undeniable and blinding. "To the ends of the earth, my lady," Arthur murmured. The hall erupted into absolute chaos. Beatrice Harrington, Genevieve's former friend, let out a shriek of mocked horror. "She's choosing the stable boy, a dirt-covered peasant." Frederick's face contorted into an ugly snarl. "You are dead to this society, Genevieve, a beggar, a whore to a nameless stray. You will starve in the mud." "Let her go," Reginald spat, turning his back on his daughter. "She is no Sterling. She is nothing." Genevieve didn't look back. Hand in hand with the nameless peasant, she walked out of the castle, leaving behind her titles, her wealth, and her entire world. The reality of her choice set in like the biting frost of the approaching winter. Genevieve and Arthur were banished to Hounds Hollow, a miserable, muddy village on the very edge of the Oakhaven territory. It was a place for the outcasts, the packless Omegas, and the disgraced. They lived in a drafty one-room cabin with a thatched roof that leaked when the snow melted, and a stone hearth that barely kept out the bone-chilling cold. Her hands, once soft and perfectly manicured, blistered and bled as she learned to scrub clothes in the freezing river, to knead tough dough, and to tend a meager vegetable patch. Her silk gowns were traded for rough-spun wool. There were nights when her muscles ached so deeply she could barely stand, and the cruel words of her father echoed in her ears. But there was Arthur. Despite the grinding poverty, Arthur was a revelation. He worked tirelessly as a woodcutter and a blacksmith's assistant in the village, returning home each night, smelling of soot and pine. He was endlessly patient, treating Genevieve with a quiet reverence that brought tears to her eyes. He would kiss the blisters on her hands, wrap her in his thick wool cloak when the fire died down, and tell her stories of the ancient, wild North. There was a profound, unshakable peace about him. Yet, as the weeks turned into months, Genevieve began to notice peculiarities about her humble husband. It started with the wolves. Hounds Hollow was surrounded by the deep woods, teeming with feral beasts that often preyed on the villagers' livestock. But the wolves never touched their cabin. Once, while gathering firewood, Genevieve watched in stunned silence as a massive timber wolf stepped onto the path in front of Arthur. Instead of attacking, the beast lowered its head, whined softly, and exposed its throat before vanishing into the trees. Arthur had merely nodded, as if acknowledging a subordinate. Then there was his healing. One afternoon, a stray axe swing in the village square opened a deep, jagged gash on Arthur's forearm. The village apothecary had panicked, claiming he would need a dozen stitches and weeks of rest. But by the next morning, the wound was nothing more than a faint, silver scar. When Genevieve questioned him, Arthur had simply kissed her forehead and murmured, "I have thick blood, Genevieve. Do not worry." But the true test of their miserable exile came 2 weeks before the winter solstice. The snow had melted into a thick, putrid slush. Genevieve was in the village square, hauling a heavy basket of wet linens, when the thundering sound of hooves echoed through the mud. A hunting party from Silverpine Estate rode into Hounds Hollow, their pristine horses and fur-lined cloaks a stark contrast to the starving villagers. Leading the party was Lord Frederick Montgomery, flanked by Beatrice Harrington and Lady Clara Wentworth. Upon seeing Genevieve, Beatrice let out a cruel, delighted laugh. "Oh, goddess! Look at her, Frederick! Is that the disgraced Lady Sterling? She looks like a common street rat." Frederick pulled his purebred stallion to a halt, purposefully steering the beast so close to Genevieve that the horse's hooves kicked up a wave of filthy black mud. The sludge splattered across Genevieve's clean laundry and her face. She stumbled back, dropping the basket into the muck. Well, Frederick sneered, looking down his nose at her. "How the mighty have fallen. How is domestic life? Genevieve, does your peasant husband beat you yet, or is he too busy wallowing in his own filth?" Lady Clara covered her mouth with a velvet-gloved hand, giggling maliciously. "She smells like pig iron and sour milk." Before Genevieve could wipe the mud from her eyes, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the square. The ambient noise of the village, the clinking of the blacksmith's hammer, the barking of dogs ceased instantly. Arthur stepped out from the blacksmith's forge. He was shirtless, his chest heaving slightly, a massive iron hammer held casually in one hand. He was covered in soot and sweat, but as he walked toward the noble hunting party, there was nothing submissive in his posture. His stride was predatory. Frederick's horse began to panic, dancing nervously in the mud, tossing its head. Frederick struggled to control it, his face flushing with anger. "Control your mutt, Genevieve," Frederick snapped, though his voice cracked slightly. Arthur didn't look at Frederick. He walked straight to Genevieve, pulled a clean rag from his pocket, and gently wiped the mud from her cheek. "Are you hurt, my love?" he asked, his voice low and incredibly calm. "No," she whispered, her hands shaking slightly. Frederick, humiliated by being ignored, reached into his coin purse. He pulled out a heavy, solid gold piece and threw it directly into the deepest puddle of mud at Arthur's feet. "Fetch it, peasant," Frederick spat. "Consider it payment for the entertainment your wife has provided us today. Go on, get on your knees and dig it out. You need it more than I do." Beatrice and Clara laughed, waiting for the disgraced stable boy to grovel. Arthur slowly turned his head to look at Frederick. He didn't speak. He didn't shout. He simply stared. Genevieve felt the air pressure drop. It was a physical sensation, a sudden heaviness in the atmosphere that made it difficult to draw breath. The scent of pine and impending storm surged, overwhelming and terrifying. A low, vibrating rumble emanated from Arthur's chest, a sound so primal and ancient that it rattled the very wooden beams of the nearby houses. It was the raw, unadulterated aura of an alpha, but not just an alpha. It was something heavier, darker. Frederick's horse screamed. The beast reared up on its hind legs, completely overcome by a blind, instinctual terror. Frederick, utterly unprepared, was thrown violently from the saddle. He landed face first in the freezing mud with a sickening squelch. The noble women shrieked in horror as their own horses bucked and fought the reins, desperate to flee. Arthur stood perfectly still, his eyes flashing a brilliant, terrifying gold for a fraction of a second before fading back to gray. He looked down at Frederick, who was sputtering and choking on mud, his expensive furs ruined. "Keep your gold, little lord," Arthur said, his voice echoing with a strange, unnatural resonance. "You will need it to buy your courage when the real winter comes." Without another word, Arthur picked up Genevieve's ruined laundry basket with one hand, wrapped his other arm protectively around her waist, and guided her away, leaving the wealthiest man in Oakhaven wallowing in the dirt like a stuck pig. Word of Frederick's humiliation spread through Hounds Hollow like wildfire, bringing both quiet satisfaction and deep terror to the villagers. They knew a man like Frederick Montgomery would not let such an insult stand. He was vindictive, petty, and held the power of life and death over the lower classes. But a greater distraction soon eclipsed the petty squabbles of Oakhaven. Messengers riding heavily armored steeds arrived in the territory, bearing banners of obsidian black and silver, the crest of the northern wastes. They brought news that sent shockwaves through the nobility. The Alpha King, Silas Blackwood, was coming to Oakhaven. Silas Blackwood was a living myth. He was the lycanthrope king who had united the brutal, warring clans of the frozen north. Rumors said he was a monster, a giant of a man who commanded legions of feral warriors and whose mere presence could force a lesser alpha to their knees in submission. He had spent the last 5 years expanding his borders, bringing rogue territories under his iron-fisted rule. Now, his gaze had turned south. He had summoned every pack leader, every noble, and every notable citizen in the southern territories to attend a grand winter solstice ball at the high castle of Silverpine. It was a feast of fealty. Those who bowed would be integrated into his empire. Those who defied him would be destroyed. The kingdom was thrown into a frenzy of preparation. Lord Reginald and the other nobles practically bankrupted themselves, ordering new silks and jewels, desperate to impress the terrifying king of the north. For Genevieve, the news meant nothing. The affairs of kings were far removed from the desperate struggle of surviving the winter in Hound's Hollow. That was, until a detachment of Silverpine guards arrived at their cabin door, 3 days before the solstice. The captain of the guard unrolled a parchment bearing Lord Frederick's seal. By order of Acting Lord Frederick Montgomery, the captain sneered, looking around the modest cabin with disgust. All able-bodied peasants of Hound's Hollow are drafted into service for the king's feast. Genevieve and Arthur, you are ordered to report to the High Castle kitchens. Failure to comply is treason. Genevieve felt the blood drain from her face. It was a calculated, malicious move. Frederick wasn't just forcing them to work. He was forcing Genevieve to return to the castle she used to rule, dressed in servant's rags, to serve the very people who had mocked her. It was the ultimate humiliation. We will not go, Genevieve said fiercely, stepping in front of Arthur. He has no right. Arthur placed a gentle, calming hand on her shoulder. He looked at the guards, his expression completely unreadable. Tell Lord Frederick, Arthur said smoothly, that we would be honored to attend the king's feast. We will be there. Arthur, no, Genevieve pleaded, as the guards rode away laughing. You don't understand what they will do. They will parade us like chained animals. Frederick will try to break you. Arthur turned to her, framing her face with his large hands. The gray of his eyes seemed to swirl like a brewing storm. Let them try, my love. I think it is time I saw this high castle for myself. And I think it is time Lord Frederick learned a lesson in hospitality. The night of the winter solstice ball was a spectacle of excessive, desperate wealth. The high castle was illuminated by thousands of candles, casting a golden glow over the snow-covered courtyards. Inside the great hall, the nobility of Oakhaven strutted like peacocks, draped in their finest velvets and shimmering jewels, nervously awaiting the arrival of the Alpha King. Genevieve stood in the shadows near the roaring fireplaces, wearing a scratchy, ill-fitting servant's uniform. She carried a heavy silver tray, loaded with crystal goblets of spiced wine. Across the room, she could see Arthur, tasked with feeding the massive hearth fires, his face illuminated by the dancing flames. Even in peasant rags, covered in soot, he possessed a quiet, magnetic dignity that made the preening nobles look like fools in costumes. Well, service with a scowl, I see. Genevieve stiffened. Beatrice Harrington and Lady Clara had cornered her near a stone pillar. They were dripping in diamonds, their eyes gleaming with malicious delight. Look at her hands, Clara, Beatrice mocked loudly, ensuring the surrounding nobles could hear. Rough as tree bark. Tell me, Genevieve, does your peasant husband make you sleep in the barn with the pigs, or do you share the dirt floor? Genevieve bit her tongue, staring straight ahead. Would you like some wine, my lady? She asked, her voice dangerously tight. I wouldn't drink anything your filthy hands have touched, Beatrice spat. Suddenly, Lord Frederick pushed through the crowd. He was dressed in a ludicrously expensive crimson tunic, a heavy jeweled crown resting on his brow, playing the part of the ruler in Lord Reginald's absence. He spotted Genevieve, and a cruel, triumphant smile spread across his face. Genevieve, Frederick drawled, stepping uncomfortably close. How fitting to see you where you belong, serving your betters. My lord, Genevieve said stiffly, attempting to step around him. Frederick blocked her path. He reached out and grabbed her chin, his grip bruising and tight. You could have had all of this, he whispered harshly. Instead, you are nothing, a slave. And later tonight, when the Northern King arrives, I will offer your pathetic husband to his guards for sport. Genevieve ripped her face out of his grip. In her sudden movement, the heavy silver tray tipped. 3 crystal goblets of dark red spiced wine shattered against the stone floor, splashing violently across the hem of Frederick's immaculate crimson tunic and his polished boots. A collective gasp echoed through that section of the hall. The music faltered. Frederick looked down at his ruined clothes, his face turning a mottled, furious purple. His eyes snapped up to Genevieve, blazing with feral, unrestrained rage. You stupid, clumsy bitch, he roared. He raised his hand, his heavy rings catching the fire, and swung a vicious backhand toward her face. Genevieve squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the impact. The blow never landed. A sound cracked through the air like a whip of thunder. The ambient chatter of the entire hall died instantly. Genevieve opened her eyes. Arthur was standing there. He had moved across the massive hall with a speed that was physically impossible, a blur of motion that defied human or basic werewolf capabilities. His massive, soot-stained hand was wrapped around Frederick's wrist, stopping the blow inches from Genevieve's face. The grip was so tight that the bones in Frederick's wrist audibly ground together. Frederick let out a strangled, pathetic whimper, his knees buckling under the sheer, crushing force of Arthur's hold. "Do not," Arthur said. His voice was no longer the quiet rumble of a woodcutter. It was a terrifying, booming vibration that seemed to emanate from the very stone walls of the castle. It commanded absolute, paralyzing submission. "Touch her." The air in the great hall grew suffocatingly dense. Several lower-ranking Omegas in the crowd whimpered, falling to their knees, clutching their throats as the dominant aura crushed the oxygen from the room. Lord Reginald, rushing forward to intervene, froze in his tracks, his eyes widening in sudden instinctual terror. "Guards!" Frederick screamed, his voice pitching high with panic. "Guards! Kill this peasant! Tear him apart!" A dozen Silverpine guards drew their swords, rushing toward Arthur. But before a howling winter wind ripped through the room, extinguishing half the candles and plunging the hall into ominous shadows. Through the doorway marched a dozen towering figures clad in heavy black steel and white direwolf furs. They were the Royal Elite Guard of the Northern Wastes, lethal, scarred, and radiating a bloodthirsty intent that made the Silverpine guards look like children playing with sticks. The nobles of Oak Haven screamed, scrambling backward, terrified that the slaughter had begun. The Northern King had arrived. At the head of the Royal Guard walked a man with a silver scar across his eye. He was Gideon, the legendary Beta of the Northern Wastes. He surveyed the chaotic, terrified hall with a look of absolute disdain. Frederick, sensing his salvation, wrenched himself away from Arthur's loosened grip and scrambled toward the imposing Beta. "My lord, thank the goddess you have arrived." Frederick groveled, pointing a shaking finger at Arthur. "This rogue peasant attacked me. He has ruined your welcoming feast. I demand he be executed in the name of the Alpha King." Gideon did not look at Frederick. He didn't even acknowledge the wealthy lord, groveling at his feet. Instead, Gideon's eyes locked onto the towering, soot-stained woodcutter, standing protectively in front of a frightened servant girl. To the absolute shock of every noble, guard, and servant in the room, the terrifying Beta of the Northern Wastes unclasped his heavy fur cloak, dropped to one knee on the cold stone floor, and bowed his head deeply. In unison, the 12 elite, bloodthirsty guards of the North dropped to their knees, their armor clanking loudly against the stone. "Forgive our delay, your majesty," Gideon's voice boomed, echoing through the dead, silent hall. "Your army awaits your command, Alpha King." The silence in the great hall was not merely the absence of sound. It was a physical weight, a crushing, suffocating pressure that forced the air from the lungs of every noble present. The elite Northern Guard, the most feared warriors on the continent, remained kneeling, their heavy black steel armor clanking softly as they bowed in absolute reverence toward the soot-covered woodcutter. Arthur slowly lowered his hand, releasing Frederick's shattered wrist. The wealthy lord collapsed onto the freezing stone floor, cradling his mangled arm against his chest. He did not scream. The sheer magnitude of what was happening had completely paralyzed his vocal cords. His face, moments ago flushed with arrogant rage, was now the color of old ash. Arthur rolled his broad shoulders, a sickening crack echoing from his joints as he discarded the hunched, unassuming posture he had maintained for months. He seemed to grow taller, his chest expanding, his presence filling the vaulted room until there was no space left for anyone else. He reached up and wiped the soot from his jawline, his storm-gray eyes sweeping over the terrified crowd. When he spoke, the low, vibrating resonance of his voice rattled the crystal chandeliers above. "Rise, Gideon," he commanded. The towering Beta stood, though his head remained respectfully lowered. "We secured the perimeter of Silverpine, your majesty. The southern garrisons have surrendered without a single drop of blood spilled. They took one look at your banners and laid down their swords." "Good," Silas Blackwood, the Alpha King of the Northern Wastes, replied smoothly. "I prefer to keep the blood off the carpets when I am visiting." A collective, muffled sob rippled through the gathered nobility. Beatrice Harrington's knees gave out, and she sank to the floor in a pile of shivering velvet, her hands clamped over her mouth. Lady Clara Wentworth looked as though she might faint, her eyes wide and unblinking. Lord Reginald Sterling, Genevieve's father broke ranks. Driven by a desperate, greedy survival instinct, he stumbled forward, his hands raised in placation. Your Majesty, Reginald stammered, his eyes darting frantically between Silas and Genevieve. Praise the goddess. We had no idea. If we had known you were gracing our lands in disguise, we would have given you the master suites. We would have thrown feasts in your honor. And to see you have chosen my daughter. My own blood. Genevieve, tell him your father always knew you were destined for royalty. Silas turned his head slowly, fixing Reginald with a stare so cold it could have frozen the marrow in the older man's bones. You sold her, Silas stated, his voice a dangerous, quiet rumble. You drowned your estate in debt to fund your own gluttony, and when the collectors came, you offered your only daughter to a monster to save your own skin. When she refused, you cast her out into the freezing mud to starve. Reginald paled, taking a trembling step backward. No, your grace. It was a misunderstanding, a test of her character. Silence. The command was laced with such heavy alpha dominance that Reginald's jaw snapped shut with an audible click, his knees buckling until he hit the floor beside Frederick. Silas turned his attention to the pathetic heap that was Lord Frederick Montgomery. The wealthy beta was shivering violently, a dark, wet stain spreading across the front of his ruined crimson trousers. The man who had terrorized the southern lands was weeping like a frightened child. Lord Frederick, Silas mused, stepping closer. The heavy thud of his boots against the stone sounded like the ticking of a doomsday clock. You are wondering why the King of the North was chopping wood in your miserable border village. Frederick couldn't speak. He only managed a frantic, trembling shake of his head. My empire is vast, Silas explained to the hall, though his eyes never left Frederick. But a kingdom is only as strong as its foundation. I had heard whispers of the southern lords, whispers of embezzlement, of cruelty, of leaders who treated their pack members like disposable cattle while they hoarded gold in their high castles. I came to Oakhaven not to conquer, but to observe, to see if the southern nobility was worth saving. Silas crouched down, bringing his face inches from Frederick's terrified, tear-streaked face. I lived among your poorest, Silas whispered, though the acoustics of the hall carried every word. I ate their meager rations. I watched children freeze because you tripled the taxes on firewood. I watched you ride your purebred stallion through the village square and throw a gold coin into the mud, demanding I grovel for it like a dog. Frederick squeezed his eyes shut, a pathetic whine escaping his throat. Mercy, he choked out. Please. Mercy. You did not show mercy to the people of Hounds Hollow, Silas replied coldly. He stood up, towering over the broken man. By the ancient laws of the lycanthrope kings, I find you guilty of treason against your own pack, corruption, and the attempted assault of my queen. The word queen sent a fresh wave of shock through the room. Gideon, Silas barked. Yes, Alpha. Strip Lord Frederick of his titles, his lands, and his wealth. Transfer his entire estate to the treasury of Hounds Hollow to rebuild the village he starved. As for him, Silas looked down with supreme disgust. Take his fine clothes. Dress him in the rags I wore. He will spend the rest of his miserable life working the mud in the lower stables of the northern wastes. If he stops working, he does not eat. No! Frederick shrieked, thrashing wildly as two massive northern guards hauled him to his feet by his armpits. No! Please! I am a lord! You cannot do this! It is already done, Silas said, turning his back on him. As the guards dragged the screaming, sobbing lord out of the great hall, Silas cast his gaze over the rest of the cowering nobility. Any lord or lady who laughed at the suffering of my mate, any who participated in the starvation of the lower castes, will face the same judgment tomorrow at dawn. The reign of your cruelty is over. The hall was dead silent, save for the crackling of the fires and the muffled weeping of the disgraced nobles. They had mocked a peasant only to invite the wrath of a god. The great hall emptied with terrifying speed, the northern guard ushering out the weeping nobility until only three things remained: Silas, Genevieve, and the heavy scent of impending snow. Genevieve stood paralyzed near the shattered crystal and spilled wine. Her mind was a chaotic storm. The man she had married, the quiet woodcutter who had kissed her blistered hands in a drafty cabin, was a phantom, a myth wrapped in soot and shadows. Silas turned to her. In an instant, the ruthless Alpha King, who had dismantled an entire ruling class, vanished. His broad shoulders softened, and the hard lines of his face relaxed into the gentle, familiar expression of the man she knew as Arthur. He took a cautious step forward, his hands raised in an open, calming gesture. "Genevieve," he said softly. She stumbled backward. The movement was involuntary, driven by a sharp, stinging sense of betrayal. "You lied to me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Every day, every word. You made a fool of me." Silas stopped, a flicker of genuine pain crossing his storm-gray eyes. "I never lied about how I felt, not for a single second." "You are the Alpha King," she cried out, the frustration finally breaking through. "You watched me ruin my hands scrubbing clothes in freezing water. You watched me starve. You let them mock me, let my father disown me, all while you had armies waiting in the shadows. Why? Was this a game to you?" Silas closed the distance between them, ignoring her retreat. He didn't use his alpha aura. Instead, he simply dropped to his knees, right there in the spilled wine. The most powerful man on the continent knelt before a woman in a scratchy servant's dress. He reached out and gently took her scarred, rough hands in his own. "It was never a game," Silas murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Genevieve, the throne of the North, is a lonely, bloody seat. I am surrounded by people who bow to my power, who covet my crown, who would say or do anything to share my wealth. Every woman they brought me saw only a king. They didn't see me." He looked up at her, his eyes burning with intense, golden sincerity. "I needed to know if true love still existed. I disguised myself and went south. I planned to stay only a week, and then I saw you." A tear slipped down Genevieve's cheek, but she didn't pull her hands away. "I saw a high-born lady," Silas continued, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles, "who possessed more fire and honor than anyone I had ever met. I watched you reject the wealthiest man in the territory because you refused to compromise your soul. I watched you choose poverty over a golden cage. I watched you choose a nameless, dirt-covered stable boy." He stood slowly, refusing to break her gaze, his hand sliding up to cup her face. "I let you live in that cabin because I needed to be sure," Silas whispered, his thumb wiping away her tear. "I needed to know that if the world fell apart, if we had nothing but mud and cold, we would still have each other, and you proved it every single day. You are the strongest person I have ever known. You are the only woman worthy of the North." The mate bond, which had hummed quietly between them for months, suddenly flared into a roaring inferno. It wasn't built on magic. It was forged in the freezing mud of Hound's Hollow, tested by cruelty and time. Genevieve looked into his eyes and realized the truth. The title was a lie, but the man was not. "Silas," she breathed. The name felt heavy, powerful, and utterly right. He smiled, a breathtaking expression that transformed his rugged face. "I prefer Arthur, when it's just us." Gideon stepped back into the hall, carrying a massive cloak of pure white direwolf fur. Silas took the cloak and swung it gently over Genevieve's shoulders, the luxurious fur covering her drab servant's uniform. "Come home with me, Genevieve," Silas said, offering his arm. "Let us leave this rotting castle to its ghosts." She lifted her chin with newfound royal grace. "Take me north, my king." The next morning, the courtyard of Silver Pine Estate was unrecognizable. The massive armored war horses of the Northern Guard had replaced the opulent carriages of the Southern lords. The people of Hound's Hollow had been summoned to the gates to witness justice. They watched in joyous silence as wagons loaded with Frederick's hoarded gold and grain were driven down into their village. Then the portcullis raised. Riding at the head of the terrifying Northern army was the Alpha King. Beside him rode Genevieve Sterling, the girl they had mocked. Draped in royal furs, a crown of braided silver on her brow, she offered the villagers a radiant smile that promised a new dawn. From the high windows of the castle, Lord Reginald and the disgraced nobles watched the daughter they had thrown away right off to rule half the continent. They had mocked her for marrying a poor man. Now, as the horns of the North blew, they learned a harsh, unforgettable lesson. Never underestimate a wolf in sheep's clothing, and never mock the woman destined to be his queen. Did you love this dramatic twist of fate? Will the disgraced lord survive their punishment in the mud? And what challenges will Genevieve face on the icy throne of the North? If you want more epic werewolf romance, smash that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more.